Before my anniversary, my son said, "We won't come. The best gift would be if you signed the estate over to us." I silently hung up the phone. The next day, I called my niece, whom I hadn't seen in 10 years. When my son finally decided to stop by, she opened the door. And what he learned after that made his blood run cold. Hello, my dear listeners. Before I begin my story, let me say a few words. If you enjoy real-life stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. It would warm my heart if you would write in the comments which city or country you're listening from. Discovering the geography of our meetings is always a small miracle. Thank you. And now enjoy the story. 80 years old. Sometimes it feels like just a number, 2 circles on a piece of paper that have nothing to do with me. And sometimes I feel every single day I've lived, every wrinkle by my eyes, every quiet ache in my joints in the morning. Today is one of those days. A day of memories. In my hands is an old photo album, bound in heavy velvet. It was once a deep cherry red, but now its color has faded, becoming a noble dull shade like old wine. I gently trace my fingers over the embossed gold letters, almost worn away by time. Our family archive. The voice of my late husband, Robert, still echoes in my ears when I read that inscription. He always did everything thoroughly to last a lifetime. I open the album. The pages of thick cardboard smell of dust and a little of vanilla. I once placed a pod between them to ward off the mustiness. Here is our estate, not yet finished, just a frame under a roof. And here, already settled, drowning in apple blossoms. On the porch sits my Robert, young, laughing, squinting in the sun. He looks directly at me, and it seems as if the photograph holds the warmth of his gaze. And on the grass, bathed in summer light, our little Russell chases a ball. A toddler with chubby legs and short trousers, a blonde cowlick on the crown of his head. I remember that day in the smallest detail. I remember the smell of cut grass, the buzzing of bumblebees in the jasmine bushes, and how my son laughed until he cried when his father tossed him up to the very sky. I turn the page. Here we are all together. Russell is already a schoolboy, with a serious face and a bouquet of asters. I am young, in a polka-dot linen dress that suited me so well. Our whole life was ahead of us, a life full of hope. I thought it would always be like this. Us, our home, our estate, our small, unbreakable world. I close the album and carefully place it back on the shelf, between volumes of Chekhov and Faulkner. The apartment is quiet, only the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Robert brought it back from a business trip to Germany. Let it count only the happy hours, he had said. And it did. The air in the rooms is filled with the thick, warm aroma of baking, vanilla, and cardamom. Today is a special day, and I have undertaken a special baking project. A brioche. I bake it not for Easter like everyone else, but only on the most important, most sacred holidays for my soul. The birth of my son, our wedding anniversary with Robert, and now my anniversary. 80 years. It's a sacred date, too. A milestone after which every new day is a gift. The dough in the large enameled bowl, covered with a towel, has risen perfectly. Fluffy, alive, it breathes under my hands. I punch it down, and it responds with a quiet, contented sigh. I remember how my mother taught me this art. With dough, my dear Catherine, you must be like with a living soul, with warmth and without fuss. I add raisins soaked in cognac, candied fruit, nuts. All the best, the most delicious for them. For Russell, for his wife Irene, for my grandchildren Michael and Catherine. I imagine them arriving, how Catherine, as always, will shout from the doorway, "Grandma, it smells so delicious in here." And Michael, already a grown 17-year-old, will smile shyly and hand me a bouquet. On the small table by the window, 2 small packages in festive paper are already waiting. A good book for Michael that he has long wanted, and a set of watercolor paints and an album for Catherine. She loves to draw so much. I imagine their joy and my heart feels warm, so warm. It is for moments like these that life is worth living. I divide the dough into pans greased with butter. My hands move on their own, with movements honed over many decades. Motherhood is not only sleepless nights and worries. It is also these simple earthly rituals, to feed, to warm, to care for. While the brioches are rising, I go to my room, to the old secretary desk. I open a small drawer, take out the envelope where I keep my pension. I count out a small sum for living expenses, for medicine, for the rent. And the rest I put in another envelope with the inscription for Russell. Last month he called, said he needed to make another payment on the car. I, of course, understand that the car has long been paid off and that this money will most likely go to some whim of Irene's, a new handbag or status boots, as she likes to say. She is a prominent woman. She needs to keep up appearances. And my Russell is soft. He can't refuse her. And how can I refuse him? He is my only son. Who else is there to help him but his mother? A mother's heart is so irrational. It gives and doesn't ask where it went, as long as her son is happy. I put the money in the envelope, and a bitter smile appears on my lips. I remembered their last visit a month ago. I had baked a whole mountain of my signature lace pancakes, thin with a crispy edge. I set the table with sour cream, homemade jam, honey. I waited. They arrived tired, irritated after work. Irene glanced at the table with a disdainful look and said loudly, so that I would definitely hear, to Russell, "Again this peasant food. I asked you, let's not cook anything, we'll stop by the store." And she took a store-bought cake in a plastic box out of a bag. Some trendy mousse with an unnaturally bright jelly on top. My pancakes stood on the kitchen table all evening untouched. And then when they left, without turning on the light in the kitchen, I just scraped them into a bag and threw them in the garbage chute. There was no resentment, no anger, only a gray, viscous emptiness inside. Russell had pretended not to notice anything. He always does that when he's uncomfortable. He just looks away. I pushed the memory away. No need to spoil such a day. Today everything will be different. Today is my anniversary. They will definitely come. The brioches are already in the oven. The apartment is filled with the final main chord of the aroma, the smell of baked dough. I sit down in my old armchair to rest my legs a little. A warm, joyful excitement is growing in my chest, like in childhood before New Year's. Time to call. Just to confirm what time to expect them, I pick up the heavy receiver of the landline phone. Its smooth, cool plastic fits comfortably in my palm. I dial my son's number. Long rings. Finally, someone picks up. "Hello." Russell's voice, somehow tired and alien. "Russell, darling, it's me, Mom." I say, and my own heart is pounding with joyful anticipation. "I just wanted to know, what time will you be here, approximately?" "Everything is almost ready." A pause hangs on the other end. A heavy, unpleasant pause. I hear a muffled but insistent female whisper in the background. Irene's voice. She's quickly and angrily dictating something to him. "Mom," Russell finally says, and his voice has a strained, false note. "About that, well, we're not coming." The words fall into the silence of my apartment like stones into a well. I am silent. My breath has caught. "Listen," he continues, and I can feel how awkward he is, how he is forcing each word out under his wife's dictation. "Irene and I were thinking the best gift you could give us. The best gift for your anniversary would be if you finally sign the estate over to us. You know, a formula, the deed of gift. Then we can celebrate everything properly." The cruel, frank, businesslike nature of his words hits me like a slap. Not physically, worse. Something inside me breaks. The warmth that had filled my chest just a minute ago disappears without a trace. And in its place, a deathly, all-consuming cold spreads. I look at my hand, clutching the phone receiver. The knuckles have turned white from the tension. There is a ringing in my ears. And he, on the other end, continues to say something about how the estate is empty anyway, that they need to expand, that it would be right, family-like. I don't hear him. I don't want to hear anymore. Without saying a word, without making a single sound, I slowly, very slowly, with a kind of detached precision, place the receiver back on the cradle. His voice is cut off mid-sentence. In the deafening silence of my apartment, filled with the sweet smell of a festive brioche no one needs, something inside me clicks. Loudly, dryly, and irrevocably, as if a switch has been flipped forever. I sat in the armchair, motionless. Time seemed to have stopped along with my heart. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, just recently so cozy and lulling, now echoed in my head with the dry, merciless blows of a hammer. A sweet, cloying smell of cooling brioches wafted from the half-open kitchen door. The smell of a holiday that would not happen. The smell of my foolish, blind motherly heart. There were no tears. I didn't cry when a real disaster happens. Tears don't come. They are for small grievances, for self-pity. And what had just happened was not a grievance. It was an end. The storm of pain did not rage within me. It froze. The resentment did not scream or thrash inside. It simply turned into a block of ice somewhere in the center of my chest. And this cold began to slowly spread through my veins, freezing everything in its path. My breathing was even. My hands lying on my lap were motionless, not a single tremor. In the ensuing silence, in this ringing void, a clarity came to me. A devastating final clarity. I suddenly saw my whole life not as a series of sacrifices in the name of love, but as a long-term investment. A failed investment. My whole life, I had been depositing into an account called Son. I had invested my youth, my health, my nerves, my money. I had invested sleepless nights at his bedside when he was sick. I had invested the refusal of a new dress to buy him a good bicycle. I had invested the patience with which I endured the barbs and neglect of his wife. I was sure that this was the most reliable bank in the world. And today I was informed that the bank had gone bankrupt. My account was closed. The balance was zero. All my investments had turned to dust. My gaze wandered indifferently around the room. The bookshelves, the porcelain ballerina figurine, the old piano that no one had ever learned to play. All of it had suddenly lost its history, had become just a set of old things. And then my eyes stopped on a photograph in a modest wooden frame on the dresser. It was me about 45 years ago, younger, happier. And on my lap sat a little girl of about 7, with tight, funny pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Alice. My niece, the daughter of my late sister Vera. I looked at this photo, and my memory helpfully supplied a picture of that day. A summer afternoon at the estate. Alice ran up with a handful of dandelions and, with a completely serious expression, handed them to me. "Aunt Catherine, this is for you. You are the most beautiful, like a queen." Her love was so simple, so pure. She asked for nothing in return. She just loved. Irene, Russell's wife, had never tolerated her. When Vera died, I became a second mother to Alice. She was often at our house until she grew up. And then Irene began her quiet war. Why is she always hanging around here? She has her own life, we have ours. She looks at you as if you owe her something. She saw some threat, some competition in the child's sincere affection. Russell, as always, was silent and looked away. And gradually, imperceptibly, Alice disappeared from our lives. The last time I saw her was about 10 years ago, at some distant family gathering. She had become a beautiful young woman, but in her gaze, that same girl with the dandelions still lived. We exchanged a few awkward phrases, and that was it. Irene stood nearby, controlling every word, every look. The memory of Alice did not bring pain or sadness. No. In the icy calm that had settled in my soul, it became a point of support. A thought, not yet formed into words, was born somewhere in the depths of my consciousness. I sat in the armchair until late in the evening. Then I stood up, went to the kitchen. Mechanically, without feeling the taste or smell, I brewed myself some tea. I threw the festive napkins, which were no longer needed, into the trash. I moved the gifts for my grandchildren to a distant corner of the table, so they wouldn't catch my eye. I slept soundly that night, without dreams, as if my body, having exhausted all emotions, had simply shut down for a reboot. I woke up in the morning a different person. A sunbeam pierced through a gap in the curtains and drew a bright stripe on the floor. Yesterday it would have seemed joyful to me. Today it was just light. I stood up, and my movements were measured and precise, like a surgeon's. No fuss, no indecision. I went to the secretary desk where all my documents and old address books were kept. I found the one I needed in a worn leather cover. The pages had yellowed, become brittle at the folds. I leafed through them, and under my fingers the names of people, many of whom were no longer in this world, came to life. Under the letter R. I found what I was looking for. Robert's Alice. And a phone number. That probably changed long ago. 10 years is an eternity. But it was worth a try. With the same cold determination, I dialed the number. My heart wasn't pounding. I just waited. After several long rings, a female voice answered on the other end, a little lower than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. Hello. For a couple of seconds I was silent, choosing my words. Alice dear, hello. It's Aunt Catherine. A silence hung on the other end. I probably caught her off guard. I was already preparing for a polite, detached answer for questions. But instead I heard her voice instantly warm up, fill with a genuine, unfeigned surprise and joy. Aunt Catherine. Oh my God, hello. I can't even believe it. I was just thinking about you the other day, honest. How are you? How is your health? And this stream of sincere, living participation melted a tiny icicle in my chest. The first ray of warmth in these terrible 24 hours. Thank you, my dear, slowly, I answered, and my own voice sounded more even than I expected. I didn't complain, didn't explain anything about Russell. It was my business, my war, which I had already lost in order to start another. Alice dear, I'm calling on business. My old aunt has an anniversary soon, 80 years. It would be the greatest joy for me to see you. Aunt Catherine, of course, I'll come, she answered without the slightest hesitation. Just tell me when and where. I'll drop everything and come. I've missed you so much. We agreed that she would come in a few days. After hanging up, I sat motionless for a few minutes. Her joy, her willingness to respond immediately. It was all like a balm to a wound. It was a confirmation that I was thinking in the right direction. And then I made a second call. I found the number of my notary, Margaret, in my address book. A smart, intelligent woman who had handled my husband's affairs. My finger froze over the phone's dial. And at that moment, another picture appeared before my eyes. 25 years ago. Robert is still alive. Russell has just married Irene. They are living with us, and every day Irene makes it clear how cramped and uncomfortable she is in an old people's apartment. Russell walks around gloomy. And one day, he asks me for money for a down payment on a cooperative apartment. A large sum that we don't have. But I have my mother's inheritance. Her antique gold earrings with alexandrite and a heavy wedding ring. A memory. The only thing I had left of my mother besides the apartment. I remember sitting in a stuffy, tobacco-smelling room with a gold buying sign. Opposite me sat an indifferent appraiser with tired eyes. He carelessly threw my mother's treasures on the scales, scratched them with a file and named a sum that seemed like a betrayal to me. I remember my hands trembling as I signed the receipt. And then I went out onto the street with a wad of impersonal bills in my pocket, and it felt like I had sold not gold, but a part of my soul, a part of my memory. That same evening, I gave the money to my son. He was happy, said, "Thanks, Mom, you're the best." Irene beamed. They bought their first apartment. And I never mentioned those earrings again until today. The memory did not bring pain. It brought steel. I decisively picked up the receiver and dialed the number. Margaret, good afternoon. It's Catherine Chandler. Catherine, I'm glad to hear from you, her cheerful voice answered. How can I be of service? Margaret, I said firmly, without a shadow of a doubt in my voice. I need to make some changes to my affairs. I would like to make an appointment with you as soon as possible. On the other end, they understood everything without extra words. The meeting was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. I hung up. The ice in my chest had not melted, but it had ceased to be just a block of inert pain. It had become a foundation. A cold, hard, unshakable foundation for my new decision. A week passed. A week that changed everything. My apartment, which had recently seemed to me a tomb for unfulfilled hopes, suddenly came to life again. It was filled with light, quiet laughter, and smells I had almost forgotten. Not the smell of baking for those who wouldn't come, but of the apple charlotte that Alice adored. She had arrived 3 days ago. She walked into the apartment, put her small bag on the floor, and the room seemed to take a deep breath. In these 10 years she had hardly changed, Only from an angular girl she had turned into a beautiful, confident young woman. But her eyes remained the same, kind and a little shy. She hugged me and I felt the last remnants of ice in my chest finally melt, turning into a warm, bright sadness for the lost years. We talked nonstop. She told me about her work. She had become a landscape designer as she had dreamed, about her small victories, about her projects, about the flowers she had learned to grow. There was so much life in her words, so much genuine passion for her work. I looked at her and thought, this is real life. Not in expensive cars and trendy bags, but in creating beauty with your own hands. Now we were sitting at the large round table in the living room. Alice had brought a huge sheet of Whatman paper and was spreading it out, holding down the corners with books. The outlines of our estate were already appearing on the sheet. "Aunt Catherine, look," she said, and her eyes were shining. "Here along the fence we can plant a hedge of thuja. It will close us off from the neighbors. And the old rose garden that Uncle Robert planted, it can be restored. We just need to prune the bushes correctly, feed them, and they will bloom again. You'll see. And here by the veranda we'll make an alpine slide." She showed me sketches drawn in pencil, and I saw my old neglected estate come to life on the paper. I hadn't been there in several years. After Robert's death, it was hard for me to go there alone. And Russell and Irene only needed it as an asset, as land for development. They were always talking about how profitably it could be sold to by something more modern. For them it was just acres of land. And for me it was a place where my husband had laughed, where my little son had run on the grass, where the roses planted by the hands of the dearest person to me had bloomed. I listened to Alice and for the first time in a long time, felt not a longing for the past, but a timid hope for the future. I looked at her inspired face and felt a long-forgotten feeling of happiness return to my soul, quiet, calm, not requiring proof. And at that very moment, the silence of our living room was shattered by a sharp, aggressive ringing of the doorbell. Not a short ring of a guest, but a long demanding buzz of someone who had come not to ask, but to demand. Alice and I exchanged glances. My heart, which had just calmed down, missed a beat. I knew who it was. They had been silent for a whole week. I hadn't called and they hadn't called. I knew that this silence frightened them. They were waiting for me to break, to call myself tearful, humiliated, ready for anything. They hadn't waited. And now they had come themselves. They had come to pressure me. "I'll get it," Alice said quietly, getting up. "Go, my dear," I answered just as quietly, remaining seated at the table. I took a cup of cold tea in my hands. Its cool porcelain pleasantly chilled my fingers. I was ready. From the hallway came voices, first a surprised male voice, then a sharp, displeased female voice. The door to the living room flew open. On the threshold stood Russell and Irene. Russell was holding a small, standard box of chocolates, a pathetic olive branch bought on the way at a gas station. He was looking at Alice, who was standing in the doorway, with open bewilderment. He didn't recognize her. In his memory, she had remained that same teenage girl whom his wife had successfully driven out of the house. But Irene recognized her immediately. Her face instantly turned to stone, her eyes narrowed. They held suspicion and poorly concealed contempt. She didn't even say hello to Alice. She just pushed her aside with her shoulder and walked into the room as if she were the mistress. Russell, as always, followed her like a shadow. They stopped in the middle of the living room. Their gazes were fixed on me. I sat calmly, motionless, holding my cup. "Mom," Russell began with that same false, feigned concern in his voice that I now recognized so well. "We were so worried. You didn't call, didn't answer our calls. We thought something had happened." I was silent, letting his words hang in the air and dissolve in it like smoke. Irene didn't waste time on preludes. She was always more direct, if one can say so, more honest in her greed. She nodded her head towards Alice, who was standing silently by the door. "What is she doing here?" she said, not addressing anyone in particular. And then she shifted her gaze to me, and there was steel in it. "You've been to the notary." There it was, the main question. Not how are you, not what's wrong with you, but have you been to the notary? I slowly placed the cup on the saucer. The quiet clink of porcelain sounded in the tense silence like a gong. I looked up and looked directly at my son, not at Irene, at Russell. My gaze was calm, clear, and absolutely empty. There was no anger in it, no resentment, only a statement of fact. Yes, I have, I answered in an even voice, devoid of any emotion. Irene nervously twitched her shoulder. Russell turned pale. Alice is here because I invited her, I continued, still looking calmly into my son's eyes. She will be living with me now. I paused, letting them process what I had said. And the estate, Russell, I pronounced the word slowly, distinctly, is no longer your concern. I have gifted it to Alice. The documents are already being processed. My will has also been changed. It became so quiet in the room that you could hear Irene's labored breathing. Russell stood as if struck by lightning. His mouth was slightly open. The box of chocolates in his hand seemed the height of absurdity. I took the cup in my hands again, although I had no desire to drink at all. It was just a gesture, an anchor that kept me in a state of this cold, unshakable calm. You said it yourself, Russell, I finished, looking over their heads somewhere into space. You said that the best gift for my anniversary would be the estate. You were right. It really is a wonderful gift. And I gave it. I gave it to someone who wants to celebrate my life, not wait for my inheritance. My anniversary is next week. You are not invited. Russell's face turned as white as a sheet. Not from anger, from fear. I saw that in his head now were not thoughts of a mother's resentment, but numbers. Numbers of loans, debts, plans built on a foundation that no longer existed. The estate was not just a country house. It was their financial cushion, their future, which they had already mentally divided and spent. Their whole life, their whole status, which Irene cherished so much, was based on the expectation of my inheritance. And now, with one calm sentence, I had pulled the support out from under their house of cards. He was silent, crushed. But the silence was short-lived. Irene, recovering from the initial shock, exploded. Her face was contorted with rage. The beautiful, well-groomed facade crumbled, revealing an ugly, greedy essence. Have you lost your mind? She screamed, and her voice became shrill, unpleasant. She pointed a finger at me. You old senile fool. He is your only son, and you are giving everything to this. She stammered, looking for the most venomous word, and threw a glance at Alice. This freeloader. This parasite. She's been whispering in your ear, bewitched you to get everything for herself. The stream of insults flowed from her non-stop. She accused, threatened, appealed to a conscience that, in her opinion, I did not have. And I sat and listened to her, and for the first time in my life, her words did not cause me pain. They were just noise, like the rain outside the window and the hum of cars on the street. They could no longer reach me. There was a wall of my calmness, of my rightness around me. I looked at Alice. She was pale but not frightened. She was looking not at Irene but at me, and in her gaze was a silent support. We were together, and that made us invulnerable. Russell, say something. Irene continued, turning to her husband. Are you going to let her do this to us? To your family? To your children? Russell looked up at me. There was a plea in his eyes. Not for forgiveness, but for me to return everything as it was. For me to become a convenient, meek, predictable mother from whom he could twist ropes. For me to cancel my decision and save him from his wife's anger, from financial problems, from the consequences of his own weakness. Mom, he croaked. But how could you? And at that moment, I knew that I had done everything right. He wasn't thinking about me. He was only thinking about himself. I didn't answer anything. I just silently looked at him. And my silence was more terrible than any accusation. It was a verdict. Finally, realizing that they would get nothing more from me, broken and humiliated, he grabbed his cursing wife by the elbow and dragged her towards the exit. We won't leave it like this, she shouted from the hallway. We'll go to court. We'll prove that you're incompetent. The front door slammed. The sound was not loud, not furious. It was dull and final. as if the lid of a coffin had been slammed shut on something that had long been dead, but everyone was trying to reanimate it. But the twist, the one that would seal their fate, was not in my will. It was in the very foundation of the estate they coveted. The next morning, a certified letter arrived for me. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a single yellowed newspaper clipping from 1950 and a short formal note. The clipping was a public notice. My late husband's grandfather, a man I'd only known through stories, had purchased the entire tract of land. The notice contained a peculiar clause, a legacy covenant, stating that the land could only be passed down or sold as a single undivided parcel. It could never be subdivided for development. He had put the clause in place to preserve the natural beauty of the area. The lawyer's note was brief. It stated that he represented a local historical preservation society and that they had been monitoring the property for years. They were aware of my son's inquiries with developers. The letter was a friendly reminder of the covenant. They knew I would never break it, but they wanted to ensure that any future heirs were also aware of their legal obligations. And then I understood. My son Russell, a real estate developer, hadn't just wanted the estate for family gatherings. His plans were much bigger. He had been working for years to get his hands on the property, not to live in but to tear down, to subdivide the land and build a lucrative housing development. My gifting the estate to Alice wasn't just an inconvenience. It had destroyed his multi-million-dollar dream. The reason he and Irene had been so desperate, the reason for their cruelty, wasn't just about losing a free vacation spot. It was about losing a jackpot they had been counting on for years. My late husband, Robert, must have known. He never spoke of the covenant, but he knew his son. He knew his son's ambition. By leaving the estate solely to me, he wasn't just giving me a home. He was giving me a shield. He had protected his family's land from his own son's greed. I was left sitting in the armchair. Alice came up and silently put her hand on my shoulder. Her warm, living touch brought me back to reality. I looked up at her. "Everything will be fine, Aunt Catherine," she said quietly. "I know, my dear," I answered. "Now I know for sure." A few months passed. Summer came into its own, generous, sunny, smelling of honey and wild herbs. My life, when I now speak of it, seems lighter, younger. The leaden weight that had pressed on my shoulders for years was gone. Alice and I moved to the estate. At first, I walked around the property and didn't recognize it. Weeds as high as my waist, a sagging fence, peeling paint on the veranda. But under Alice's skillful and loving hands, the garden began to awaken. She worked from morning till night, and I, as much as my strength allowed, helped her. We weeded, dug the beds. Alice restored the old rose garden, and the roses planted by my Robert bloomed again, huge, velvety, dark red. Their fragrance in the evenings was intoxicating. Last week, I did something I had long dreamed of but always put off. I withdrew money from my savings account, the very money I had been saving for decades for Russell's rainy day, for his unforeseen expenses. And with this money I bought a gazebo, a beautiful carved one made of light wood. It was placed in the farthest corner of the garden, under an old apple tree. Now Alice and I drink tea there in the evenings, wrapped in blankets, and watch the sun set behind the forest. Recently, a mutual acquaintance, meeting me at the village store, told me the latest news. Russell and Irene had sold their chic car, moved from a prestigious area to a smaller apartment somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Their business, built on borrowed funds in anticipation of future infusions, had faltered. I listened to this news calmly, without gloating, without triumph. It was just information, a fact like a weather forecast. The problems of my son and his wife no longer took up space in my heart. They had become strangers to me, whose life flows somewhere in parallel, without intersecting with mine. Now I am sitting on the freshly painted porch of our estate. On my shoulders is a warm shawl knitted by Alice. The sun has already touched the treetops, painting the sky in soft watercolor tones. Alice is watering the flowers in the garden. Her silhouette in the sunset rays seems so peaceful. She is humming something to herself. I look at this revived garden, at this house filled with quiet happiness, and I think not about the family I lost, but about the one I have found. For decades, I lived for others, spoke with other people's voices, breathed other people's desires. And only when I was left in a deafening silence, I was finally able to hear my own. This quiet joy, this evening sun on my hands, this peace in my soul. All this became possible only on that day when I found the courage. The courage to hang up the phone, to stop listening to lies, and to dial another number to invite truth into my life. At 80, I finally returned home. To myself. Thank you for being with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and write in the comments if you have had to deal with similar situations. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Be healthy and live truly.